My name is Michael Sinatra. I'm the director of the Centre de Recherche Interuniversitaire sur les événements empiriques and the professor of English here at the Département des Littératures de Langue du Monde. It's my great pleasure, with the support of the Canada Research Chair in Digital Textuality that Marcello Vitali Rossadi is the chair of, to welcome Tim Fulford to Montreal this morning to talk to us about a fascinating project on picturing the picturesque tour or making a digital edition of an early 19th century manuscript. Tim Fulford has a wide-ranging and illustrious career, and I'll mention just a couple of his many accomplishments, namely a numerous series of books and articles on topics wide-ranging on Wordsworth, Coleridge, Mary Robinson, Jane Austen. He also edited the scholarly edition of Robert Southey and Humphrey Davy, and is currently working on a monograph on the study of the late poets and the late poetry of that group in particular. And I had the pleasure, among many other things over the years, that I've known Tim, which is now over 20 odd years since we met at the Coleridge Conference in '96, to edit a volume with him on the Regency period, a couple of years that came out from Fulford. So welcome back to Montreal, Tim.
Thanks very much for having me, Michael, and inviting me. It's nice to be here again. This is not really going to be a formal read-out talk, at least parts of it maybe. Other parts are going to be me showing you various aspects of the edition and raising some of the issues and problems that I faced as I was making the edition, and some of the problems that still remain with the edition. So, if you have things you'd like to ask as I do that and flick from part to part of the edition, or comments you'd like to make, please make them. This would be nice if this was an informal and interactive occasion, rather than my just reading out this paper. So I'll start by introducing a little bit about the edition and why I did it and what's involved in it, and indeed who's involved in it. So it began with this. The Banks of Wye, a poem in 4 books by Robert Bloomfield, originally published in 1811. And as you can see, the title page there, rather small, but has a nice picturesque engraving. It's a little difficult to make out, but there's a shepherd with his staff and some sheep and the trees arranged on either side of the image, as the picturesque theory suggested you should do to create a rough and informal understanding of the mixed nature of nature. And on the extreme right just here, you can actually just about see a bend of the River Wye, the banks of Wye. And there were 2 reasons really why I was interested in doing an edition of this. One was that I was at the time living on the banks of the Wye myself, so it was very much exploring my home ground and my natal territory. And in relation to that, the River Wye historically has been a very extremely important place, the place really where the whole picturesque began. The various picturesque theorists and the picturesque tour began by responding to the scenery of the River Wye. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So I was interested in the picturesque and the history of it as an understanding of landscape, both in pictures and in the way you organize landscape on the ground. So, for instance, the park here in Montreal is a picturesque park that descends, at least indirectly, from the River Wye, in that Olmsted, who designed it, was very much working in the tradition of English landscape gardens that were shaped by the picturesque. Humphrey Repton, the landscape gardener, was an important influence. So there is a line from the River Wye, it flows into the Atlantic and then to the St. Lawrence, and you get to Montreal. The picturesque has spread across the Western world as an aesthetic. There was that, and there was also Robert Bloomfield. Has anyone in this room actually heard of Robert Bloomfield? Two people, and you don't count, Michael, because you only heard of it because I talk about it at dinner. So for those of you who haven't, I'll introduce him very briefly. Robert Bloomfield he's a forgotten figure now. He was the best-selling poet of the first 15 years of the 19th century. So Wordsworth and Coleridge, who we know now as the great Romantic poets, they sold their books in the hundreds. Robert Bloomfield's most famous poem, The Farmer's Boy, sold over 50,000 copies during his lifetime. He was actually the first mass-selling poet on an expanded print market. The 19th century vastly expanded readership, it expanded circulation, it expanded the production of books, and it made literary stars for the first time. And we all know that the main literary stars of 19th century poetry were Walter Scott, who became an enormously successful phenomenon, and then Byron. But before them, and then at the same time, Robert Bloomfield. And he continued to sell throughout the 19th century. Sales figures suggest that he was in the top 5 best-selling poets for the whole 19th century for that period. And these poets were selling in numbers that are really inconceivable now. Tennyson was selling in the hundreds of thousands. And Bloomfield is reckoned sold 75,000 copies of his books during the entire 19th century. And of course, these days, poets, again, sell in hundreds rather than in thousands and tens of thousands. So he was a publishing phenomenon. And it interested me that he was, but despite that, he has been completely forgotten in the late 20th century, not taught on university curriculums. So I wanted to do something about that and make an edition of this, his tour poem of the Banks of Wye, available, a scholarly edition, available so that students, fellow scholars, could actually start to assess it. I didn't really want to do that in book form, and that's for 2 reasons. One is that it would be very expensive and nobody would buy it. So if you're trying to revive interest in a forgotten poet, that's not the way to go. So a web edition that is free for people to browse and look at is the way to go. So I wanted to do it on the web for that reason. And the other reason that I wanted to do it, what is the other reason that I wanted to do it? There must have been one. I had already done an edition of this chap's letters and put that up on the web. So this was, as it were, adding to a whole scholarly enterprise to revive this person. And yes, the main reason I wanted to do this was because, okay, so John Clare used to be 40 years ago, 50 years ago, in the same position that Bloomfield is now. Almost nobody knew about John Clare. The texts of his poems were extremely hard to find, except in a few small selections. It was very difficult to know what he'd written and get a sense of the extent of it. Very little was known about his life. And a large industry began in the 1960s and revived interest in John Clare. So he's now acknowledged as a really important poet and very widely read and up there all over the internet and many editions. Well, Bloomfield was the mentor of John Clare. Clare emulated Bloomfield. And Bloomfield, like Clare, was a labouring class poet, an unusual thing to be. He was originally a poor boy brought up in the countryside. From the labouring classes, literacy and book buying and book reading was pretty uncommon amongst the farmhands where he grew up. As a young man, a teenager, he moved to the poorest part of London with his brother, his older brother, and he became a shoemaker. Again, this was just about at the bottom of the kinds of trades you could do as a labourer, extremely poor. He and his brother were living with many other men in a tiny shared house and making shoes up in the garret. This was really pinched labour, sweated labour. So it was as a shoemaker, a lady's shoemaker actually, he made fashionable shoes, that he began to write poetry. And so I wanted to revive interest in Bloomfield because it's very unusual that a labouring class person should become a poet. And when they do become a poet, like John Clare, they have a different perspective on many of the central things that occupied poets in the 18th and 19th century. They see things from a different point of view. And Bloomfield's poetry in particular does. It sees rural labour, the rural scene, romantic nature, from the perspective of someone who works on the farm, rather than simply owning the farm. So it understands nature from the point of view of labour and from the bottom up. We understand that that's what happened with John Clare, and it gives him a unique perspective and a different take on nature. And I wanted to show, by providing these editions, how that worked before Clare was writing for Bloomfield. So this edition was an attempt to do that. Let's move on. It's a little faint. In 1807, Bloomfield, who by now was a successful publishing phenomenon, although still not a wealthy man, was invited to go on a tour, a journal of a 10 days tour from Ely in Gloucestershire by way of Ross, down the River Wye to Chepstow, Abergavenny, Brecon, Hereford, Malvern. He was invited to go on a tour by some well-meaning liberal patrons, people from a much higher social class than he was, a leisure tour of the River Wye. And this is the title page of the manuscript journal and sketchbook that he compiled of the tour. Go back, that's the poem, The Banks of Wye, that he produced after having been on the tour and that was published. It's a 4-book poem, travelogue poem. And this is the unpublished sketchbook and prose journal of the tour. So both of these things came out of the tour, and I wanted to create a website that would put one against the other. So we'd see a scholarly edition of the poem, interesting travelogue poem about the picturesque, but we'd also see what the manuscript materials look like, not the manuscript of the poem just, but the prose journal, and put this sketchbook on the net. So those were my materials, and this is a little summary of what I produced. The facsimile of the manuscript sketch and scrapbook that he made after his tour, an annotated transcription of the tour journal that he incorporated into the scrapbook, and then a collated and annotated text of the poetic versions of the tour that were published. So I wanted to do a proper scholarly edition of the poem, not just put some text up on the net, but collate the variants in the various editions he published during his lifetime, trace the differences in the text. And then obviously take advantage of the visual medium of the net, put reproductions of the engravings that illustrated the publications up there, and then deleted passages or unadopted passages from the manuscript of the poem, a selection of reviews from journals of the time. And then there are various scholarly resources as well. I identify the places that he mentions in the poem. I identify all the people who get mentioned in the poem or in the tour journal. and I provide various footnotes and references to other texts. All the kinds of things that are actually quite hard to do in a book publication, because there would have to be so many different gatherings of pages that you would use. Are much easier to do on the net. So that's an outline of what the edition was intended to look like. And now, before we look at the edition and I talk about the problems, I'm going to give you some context as to why it might be an interesting thing to study and to look at. We'll talk a little bit, first of all, about the tour of the River Wye. This is the Upper Wye on an autumn day, not too far from where I used to live, in fact. And this, you may know. Anybody guess what that is? Anyone going to venture? You're a coward. Oh, you're getting help, I can hear.
Well, I've never been there. Is Tinton Abbey like a ruin, or is it actually a...
That is Tinton Abbey, yeah. All the abbeys in
Yeah.
Actually, I paid her to arrive at just this point. So all the abbeys in Britain, more or less, are ruins because King Henry VIII decided that he would nationalize the abbeys and take their wealth in the 1530s, when he decided that Britain would become Protestant and he would be the head of a Protestant church. So at that point, he nationalized the abbeys and sold them. And they were sold to local landowners who made what profit from them that they could, which usually meant taking off the roof because the lead on the roof was valuable. And once the roof was taken off, they became ruins, and have been ruins then for over 400 or 500 years now in the English landscape. And that is Tinton Abbey, yes, which of course is a famous abbey because it became the abbey mentioned in the title of Wordsworth's famous poem, the great romantic lyric, lines composed a few miles above Tinton Abbey. But not just because of that. For other reasons as well, Tinton Abbey became quite a totemic site that influential in the picturesque. And these slides will show why Tinton Abbey and the whole tour of the River Wye became so internationally important. This is from William Gilpin's tour of the River Wye, or Observations on the Picturesque. His rather crude aquatint of the abbey in situ. Gilpin was one of the first people to define the picturesque aesthetic, and he did so by touring the Wye and describing what he saw, and wanting to turn the Wye into a series of sort of pictures or tableaux, which represented, he thought, a new kind of art that was not simply classical or neoclassical beauty, nor was it the terrible sublime. It involved a kind of shaggy, rough aesthetic that was supposed to be closer to nature. And you can see in his aquatint he's been doing this. He's arranged the view so that we have a tree just in the corner, half in and half out of shot. He's deliberately used the oval frame because the roundness goes with the roundness of the hills. And the idea of the ruin, something incomplete, not perfectly symmetrical, and therefore not beautiful anymore, also becomes part of the picturesque. So it's through this that Gilpin starts to set out what picturesque beauty is through this tour of the Wye, and particularly of Tinton. It caught on, it became an extremely significant aesthetic, imaged by very many watercolorists and oil painters. So it became almost compulsory as part of your bid to become a well-known artist, to go down the River Wye and to make a picturesque watercolor of it, which would very often then be engraved and circulated on a mass scale as a print. So this is Thomas Girtin, the watercolorist. Again, this slightly blurred, shaggy aesthetic of the incomplete and the rough. Not quite the pastoral, but with sheep and cows and some signs of rural labour. So this is a labouring boat, but viewed from afar with a pleasant soft focus. This is the essence of the picturesque. And we all know it because it became the basis of picture postcards. If you've sent a postcard from some place you've been on holiday, often that will have a view that's framed in a picturesque manner, the distance view. And one other little thing I wanted to point out about this picture, that'll crop up later in the talk, is this here. That's a pleasure boat, a tourist boat, specially designed for you to be able to take the 2 or 3 days tour, supplied with hampers and wine, and often with a chap who had a horn so that when you went through a rocky gorge, he could sound his trumpet and you could hear the echoes. So this is a tourist landscape already being imaged here, actually for tourists. You could consume this at home in its engraved form at least, as well as be there, but it shows that it was already, as well as a labouring place of trade, already a tourist zone. So that's Girtin. Here is Turner. So the aesthetic of the ruin, through which we contemplate time and the passing of time and the end of empire, but a harmony between nature, the ivy, and the ruined works of man, nature reassuming. So again, a picturesque watercolor by Turner, made to be engraved and passed around in books. This is a much cruder, later image. Tinton as a romantic scene by moonlight, beautifully lit. The thing to notice here, again, is all these people down here, not very well drawn people down here. These are tourists, and the guides are holding up blazing torches. So this has become part of the tourist experience. I've done this, it was fun. You go at midnight on a moonlit night, and these days you buy one of those things that you use in your backyard if you're having a barbecue. It's kind of glowing wand. You carry it around with you and you get all sorts of interesting shadows. So the tourist experience continues, and there it is, imaged. So this is the context for Bloomfield's tour, a popular national and in the end international aestheticization of an activity and a place that helps to define a picturesque aesthetic that goes into landscape and parks across the Western world. Turner, a much later Turner, that's rumoured to be the River Wye at Tinton Abbey, but could probably, knowing the later Turner, just as well be Venice. Light effects in nature, a romantic landscape. And finally, this is an amateur watercolour done entirely in grey washes, grisaille painting. Bloomfield. So Bloomfield's manuscript sketchbook takes its little place as part of this much larger tradition of sketching and imaging the why and trying to define the picturesque. And understanding the picturesque as something in motion, something you perceive as you tour, as you move through the landscape. You're effectively, as an artist, taking snapshots of a mobile tourist process. Artists, of course, complete sketchbooks before they publish worked up watercolors. Bloomfield created a sketchbook that was also a prose tour journal. This is from the start of it. It's a county map that he's pasted in. It's kind of scrapbook. So he's creating a monument to his tour, just as we would create in the old days a scrapbook if we went on holiday with a bunch of friends, or these days you share the photographs that you take. You share them somewhere on the web so you can access them again, or you make some Facebook posts and share images and impressions with your select group of friends. Bloomfield did this by creating a manuscript sketchbook and tour journal, which he shared with the people he'd been on tour with. That's the map it starts with. Here is a page of his writing, and on the bottom left here, this is his crude image of their coach, their carriage, being carried across at the very start of the journey on planks, two boats strapped together. That was the way in which they initially crossed the river. They then hired and picked up one of the tour boats, which you can see Bloomfield imaging there, and were rowed down the river. And as they went, Bloomfield sketched and worked these up and sent them afterwards. He is a crude artist, so you might like to hear his letter. About his own artistic prowess. He says, "I have succeeded beyond the former estimates of my own self-approving vanity. And the proof that I possess that latter article, vanity, is my telling you so. The pictures are all done by candlelight. These long winter evenings are all in my favour, and you may figure to yourself the solid oak of my old table, bearing on its back half the castles in Wales, besides my two elbows, and all the paraphernalia of drawing. Remember that though I am in general pleased with my own performances, I perceive that some of my trees are amazingly like a pile of Cheshire cheeses. And one in particular I struggled with. It seemed to have a determination to resemble a large jar with a handle, but I cut the handle off and it became as good a tree as the rest." So he's an amateur sketcher, and he's not really offering his sketches as important art. They are tourist mementos of an occasion. Here he is sketching Tinton. Why is that interesting? Well, think of the culture of sketching that's talked about, for instance, in Jane Austen's novels. Young gentlewomen are taught to sketch and to draw as one of their polite accomplishments, and to show their sketches and drawings to each other and to visitors. It becomes part of polite middle-class sociability in the 19th century, something you do to make alliances with others and to demonstrate your taste. Actually, it's one of the things in Jane Austen that young women might be called on to do to demonstrate their suitability for marriage, to attract a suitor. If you've read Wilkie Collins' The Woman in White, the drawing lessons are a central feature of that novel. So it's an important part of middle-class culture, and this is contributing to that visual culture. But it's a visual culture that normally we only hear about. You see references to it in novels. There aren't very many examples what it actually looked like. And so I wanted to publish this because it's sketches, but it's also informal prose. It's written by Bloomfield, but it's circulated amongst his circle. They add things to it. So it's quite a rare example of what was an important aspect of early 19th century and Victorian middle-class culture, manuscript culture. Also in the 19th century, there is a revolution in bookmaking, in print culture. It becomes very much easier technologically to illustrate books, much cheaper, with the introduction of steel engravings and stereotype printings. And so there is an inundation of the book market for the first time of illustrated magazines, literary annuals, of illustrated books. Often these take the form of tours. So Turner, the famous artist, makes far more money and makes far more renown as an illustrator of books, engravings in books. So William Rogers' Italy is a long tour poem or series of tour poems about Italy, which feature Turner engravings. This sold by the thousands. People bought it not for the poetry, but for the engravings. It was a novelty, this idea of books that were heavily illustrated. And Charlotte Bronte talks about this. It's in Jane Eyre, in fact, poring over these images in books on dark evenings lit by lamps, because they're a fascinating avenue into another world that you wouldn't otherwise get to see because you're not very mobile. So Bloomfield's tour poem that he publishes in 1811 is illustrated with engravings, some of them derived from the manuscript sketchbook. And so I wanted to publish that because it contributes to this rise of illustrated books, which are topographical and allowing audiences to go somewhere else visually for the first time between the covers of books. Formerly in the 18th century, you had to be a very rich antiquarian to afford very highly priced, heavily illustrated books. Now you can be an ordinary member of the middle class and buy illustrated books showing you images of Italy or here the River Wye, where you could actually then go on holiday. So that's the frontispiece from Bloomfield's published poem, The Banks of Wye. And here's an engraving from the middle of book 1, I think. This is called The New Weir. You can see the water's about to plunge over a weir there on the lower right, and these are the rocks of Simon's Yacht on the left.
That very side.
No, that's a stipple engraving. So the images in these books would all be black and white. Okay, so one other context to tell you about that I think is important about the Wye tour and why I wanted to do this. Oh, we don't need to look at that, do we? Let's look instead at... No. That's the splash page. So one other context that I think was really important about the tour of the River Wye, it's actually the origins of the tourist industry in Britain, and therefore the organised tourist industry, mostly in Europe. There had been the grand tour of Europe that noblemen took with a guide, a local guide, and often a tutor who went with them. But that became impossible in the 1790s because Britain was at war with France and Europe was closed. So what developed was a middle-class tourist trade for the first time. And this developed on the River Wye. We saw those pictures of boats. From the 1750s, the River Wye became the first place where there was a kind of package tour. You could go to a particular place and guides were for hire. You could buy a guidebook there. There were several different published, and there were boats for hire at different levels of price according to how much luxury you wanted of your boat. And there was an itinerary, you knew how many days it would take. So you didn't have to be a nobleman who arranged and commissioned all this for yourself, for your servants. It was already there for you. And it would take you down the river in a series of stages, culminating in Tinton, where you had breakfast, and then you would move on to Chepstow. So it's the first organised tour. And it's out of this, organising this kind of tour, that Thomas Cook began, who of course became the worldwide leader of tourism in the 19th century, Cook's Tours, and Thomas Cook still exists. So again, from small beginnings on the River Wye, you start to see a middle class industry begin. So the banks of Wye contributes or is part of that organised tour experience. So to the edition, what do you do? How to do this? When I started with this, the Manuscript Tour Journal, which is in the British Library, and I paid to buy facsimiles of. So I had that, a manuscript journal. Which looks like this. Not very much use just putting that up on the net. Who's going to be able to read it or make any sense of it? So I had that, and then I had a published poem. There's the frontispiece again from the poem. And I could make a transcription of the poem. Which I've done there. But you can look at that on Google Books. Although you couldn't when I actually first did this, but you can now. So what value are you going to add making a web edition from just everyone being able to look on Google Books? And how was I going to relate this poem with this manuscript prose journal and sketchbook? Both relate them in a scholarly sense, how create the scholarly links between them, to show how the one got published and the other didn't, and yet the one was related to the other, but also how visually to relate them to each other. These were the kinds of issues, and I don't know that I've actually solved them that well. So to talk to you a little bit about the poem here, to give it more value than just going to Google Books, I made a transcription of the poem with hyperlinks so that if you click on the name of the person it's dedicated to, you get an explanation of who he was. And everybody mentioned in the journal and the poem is filled in for you. So this has the kind of function that footnotes might do in a book edition. Go back, and the places as well are also explained. So you can follow every place that's mentioned in this tour poem, and that will give you a sense of where everything is. What I didn't do, but could have done had I known more, was, for instance, have a map pop up at this point so that the places were not only mentioned and explained, but plotted on a map for us. I haven't used GIS. That tool wasn't really available when I did this edition, but one could do that, I think. So here is a transcription of the poem as published in 1811. And what I wanted to do here was make this a proper scholarly edition of the poem in the traditional sense that would therefore allow Bloomfield's verse to be taken seriously. So I've recorded the variants from different editions as hyperlinks. And Bloomfield's own notes. And I've provided my own notes so that shrieks of an agonizing king mentioned in the text is explained as a reference to Thomas Gray's poem, describing the death by means of a red-hot poker inserted into the rectum of King Edward II at Berkeley Castle. And those of you who've read Marlowe's play, Edward II, or seen it, will remember that scene. So that's the poem text. How then to make that relate both visually and in a scholarly sense to the manuscript, prose journal, and sketchbook? The problem I had with that was that Bloomfield himself doesn't key the two things in relation to each other. And I didn't want to prioritize one above the other as the most important thing for the user of this edition, so that you'd only be able to approach one through the other. That would, as it were, precondition the visual and the reading experience in a way that would be quite coercive. So, for instance, you'd only be able to get to the poem by going into the manuscript tour journal, the prose journal, finding a passage, and then clicking, and a bit of the poem would pop up as an excerpt. That would turn the poem into a series of little excerpts that were illustrative of the prose journal. It wouldn't allow the poem to be a standalone published thing as it was. And equally the other way around, if the manuscript journal was only available as a series of hyperlinks to the published poem, again, you get little excerpts that are, as it were, illustrating the main thing. I didn't want to do that. That was too coercive of the readerly experience. So I've kept them on the left here as alternatives. You can go from one to the other. What you can't do, therefore, quite so well is hop across from a passage in the poem to a passage in the manuscript journal. You have to go back into the sidebar, and then the manuscript journal appears. Only it doesn't quite appear. That's to say, there wasn't very much use in just showing people the facsimiles. Hard to read. So I made a transcription of the facsimiles. So the transcription then allows you to click to the relevant image that's relevant to that place in the text. And the transcription, the images rather, don't just include the pictures in the sketchbook. That's a better standard image by one of Bloomfield's friends, someone who understands the principles of picturesque composition, Robert Bransby Cooper. So the transcription clicking takes you to the text itself. So you can actually start to see how in this genre of the manuscript journal, the images are actually incorporated with the text. And so it's a multimedia thing from the start. It's not simply a watercolorist making a few notes to his images. The two things are there in relation to each other from the start. So you can at least access that.
Is that a grinding stone or something? What is that image?
Let's go back. It's a stone cross, almost perfect, having an upright stone on which the image was formerly placed. What's nice about the prose journal is Bloomfield's particular perspective. As a labourer, he doesn't just see what the normal tourist saw. He's in an anomalous position on this tour. He's a poet, so he's been invited by the patrons. He's a guest, so he's a man of leisure. He's being served by servants, by boatmen who are rowing them down the stream. Whereas normally in his life, he is himself a labourer of the same class as these servants and boatmen and farmhands. So this gives him an anomalous position on the boat. Which class is he of? What's he doing? It's potentially an uncomfortable position. Where does he stand and sit? But what it means in the prose journal is that he's able to see and note and record things that normally get omitted from this kind of picturesque view. So in Ross, we hear him chatting with a shoemaker, not the kind of person that a gentleman tourist normally records talking to. He then discusses the price of cider with their Welsh guide, so the tour journal records him talking to the guides and the labourers. And he notes that the Welsh girl who served their meal at Tinton Abbey was glad to see them go. Everywhere, he's immediately interested in the people who work the landscape, regarding them as authorities on it as important as the guidebooks and aesthetic treatises and county histories. There's one point where his viewpoint, which traditionally in the picturesque, you arrive at a particular spot that you choose on the side of a hill, which gives you a view downwards and into the distance. The picturesque is often about organising viewing spots, viewpoints. Just like in the park at the top of the hill at Montreal, is actually here at the hill, that created pavilion and viewpoint. That's a very picturesque thing, a station from which everybody's supposed to take the view. Bloomfield's viewpoint also includes the cracks of the floorboard in his bedroom at the inn. And he's looking through the cracks of the floorboard downstairs at the maids and the grooms for the horses taking their breakfast together in the back kitchen and overhearing what they're saying. So he has this contrasting viewpoint. And this gets into the poem as well. So to go back, one of the things I put in the edition was some contextual materials, reviews from the time. So here's a review from the Eclectic Review, which nicely responds to the sense of Bloomfield as offering you a different view. Though everyone that has journeyed for a few miles at such a time must have seen the circumstance noted in the three last lines, whoever thought of it before? And yet it is the peculiarity of this general incident that gives life and motion to the whole scene. The Eclectic Review is heralding Bloomfield as a poet who is accurate to plain nature, doesn't idealise, quite a Wordsworthian poet, in other words. It makes that which before was only an object of perception, a subject of reflection, and in such strokes as these, the unattainable art of the genuine poet of nature is more fully discovered than in the most ostentatious parade of wholesale description. So the unattainable art of the genuine poet of nature turns out in the quote to be the view of the labourer. Because if you read the quote that follows, brown waved the harvest, dale and slope, exulting bore a nation's hope. Sheaves rose as far as sight could range, and every mile was but a change of peasants labouring, labouring still, and climbing many a distant hill. So what Bloomfield sees, which most landscape poets do not see, or at least if they see, they don't take notice and think about it. Bloomfield does, and for this critic it makes Bloomfield a poet of nature, is that nature is worked and it depends on the peasant's labour. Here emphasised, labouring, labouring still. This is a landscape that involves sweat, involves back-breaking field work. And Bloomfield has done that, and that's why he records it. So you see, I'm being Marxist here, of course, the landscape as the product of class relationships based on the uneven organisation of labour and wealth. So here is Bloomfield taking the gentleman's point of view. He's in a boat passing by. Normally, those gentlemen only see aesthetic beauty, natural beauty, but Bloomfield has a proto-Marxist perspective from his anomalous position. He's viewing as he goes by a life of leisure, but he views and sees labour because at least he has a memory of that, and that causes him to record it in his poem. I'll finish with a quote from the poem, since we actually haven't discussed really what the poem says very much. By way of kind of showing you why I think the poem is interesting and worth exploring. And maybe explaining perhaps also why Bloomfield got forgotten as a poet. Because it's Augustan poetry, but it's written in 1807. The kind of poetry that was popular 70, 80 years before. So Bloomfield is a romantic poet in many of his attitudes and in some of the things he sees, but his form and style at the time was old-fashioned, but nevertheless extremely popular, when Wordsworth's new style of poetry was not popular. But subsequently, by 1900, it's Wordsworth's new style of poetry that was viewed as the innovative thing, and the kind of poetry that Bloomfield wrote, a continuation of older styles, was neglected. But this passage, I think, is Bloomfield at his finest. This is Iambic Tetrameter, an unusual meter, often associated with comic verse. And he uses it to comic effect. But also, as well as comic effect, it can have quite profound effects. So this is a meditation on the ruins of Raglan Castle, which was ruined in the Civil War in the time of King Charles I. First of all, Bloomfield evokes the triumph of nature over man's achievements, however violent and however heroic those achievements once were. So he says, majestic Raglan, harvests wave where thundering hosts their watchword gave, when cavaliers with downcast eye struck the last flag of loyalty. This was the last stand of the royalist forces at Raglan Castle. It was besieged. That's what the footnote explains. Then, left by gallant Worcester's band, to devastation's cruel hand, the beauteous fabric bowed, fled all the splendid hours of festival. No smoke ascends, the busy home is heard no more, no rolling drum, no high-toned clarion sounds alarms, no banner wakes the pride of arms, but ivy, creeping year by year, of growth enormous triumphs here. Each dark festoon with pride upheaves its glossy wilderness of leaves on sturdy limbs, that clasping bow broad o'er the turret's utmost brow, encompassing by strength alone, in fretwork bars the sliding stone, that tells how years and storms prevail, and spreads its dust upon the gale. The man who could unmoved survey what ruin piecemeal sweeps away, works of the powerful and the brave, all sleeping in the silent grave, unmoved reflect that here were sung carols of joy by beauty's tongue, is fit where'er he deigns to roam, and hardly fit to stay at home. So the ivy embraces the stone as the castle moulders, the plant prospers, until the monuments of martial valour are encased in a wilderness of leaves, and the sound of human life gives way to the stifling constriction of the creeper. These are sophisticated verses that demonstrate how much could still be achieved in the Augustan rhyming couplet. And partly this is a matter of illusion. Milton's serpent Satan is not far behind the snake-like plant that with pride upheaves itself at the tower's expense. But of course, it's also a result of lexical vividness, rhetorical insistence, and syntactical energy, which I hope my reading made evident, creating urgency. Bloomfield pressures his reader to feel awed and threatened by a nature that in the figure of the ivy represents the triumphant and vampiric power of death, supporting itself on the works of mankind. Yet at the same time, the ivy encases the crumbling masonry, and so it configures a natural growing memorial to a defunct human edifice. It's as if the stone is crumbling away inside the ivy, so that the ivy might become a self-supporting structure, marking the absence of the thing that originally it climbed up. You once had a stone tower, you end up with an ivy tower, with no stone left inside it. Is that menacing, or is that in a way a kind of perpetuation, a recreation by nature of what was man's? It's all a post-Edenic fallen world, where nature on the one hand is beautiful, the ivy leaves are glossy, and on the other hand menacing, because it configures time, death, and in Miltonic terms, sin. It's been a place of battle, of death. And these are fundamental to growth and remains. It's a world too in which nature and humanity, represented by historical monuments to human deeds of violence, are together but also at odds. And it's to perceive this and understand this that it is worth touring. This is Bloomfield's justification, moral justification of the point of the Wye Tour. The man who could survey this unmoved is fit and hardly fit to stay at home. If you're not going to be moved by this, don't bother to travel. The point of traveling is to understand such things as this. So this isn't a romantic discourse. It doesn't say it doesn't subjectivize the experience from a personal viewpoint. It generalizes and moralizes in an Augustan way. But it nevertheless comes back home to a lesson about, or an intuition about death, survival, ruin, decay, and the need to preserve. Preserve partly through song, carols of joy by Beauty's tongue, which is an oblique reference, of course, to the poem itself, as song. So in the end, Bloomfield touring is taking part, to sum up what I've been saying, in a middle-class exercise of manuscript culture, making sketchbooks, being sociable, swapping impressions. He's offering you, in his prose tour journal, a shrewd and humorous travelogue that understands labour in the landscape and reflects on the picturesque. He's contributing to the development of manuscript culture and print culture as he celebrates this new tourist activity, the Wye Tour. But he has a more fundamental purpose too in his poetry, which is to cause us, as great poetry should cause us, to reflect on what it is to be human. That's in the end the purpose of touring. So I'll finish there.
Thank you very much. It was really, really interesting, and discovering all of that. I have a question about the relationship between the scholarly approach and the more general public interest of this material. I I mean, in your presentation, you underlined that Bloomfield is a popular writer, and all these contents, even today, could be addressed to a very general public, not only a scholarly public. And the approach of your edition, on the other hand, is more a scholarly erudite approach. So, what do you think about that? Do you think, in one way, one could say that you give XML-TI data and you can produce whatever you want with this kind of data? So, for instance, geolocalizing them, as you were mentioning, and put them on a map and give them to tourists on the way.
Yes, you certainly do that. Yes.
You know, and so I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about the relationship and sometimes the struggling between the scholarly approach and the more general public one? This is the first part of the question, and the second one is more trivial. What about the recognition and the legitimacy for a scholar to write, to make a web edition, just because it is not always recognized as a printed edition,
right.
But in your case, it's really the same value and the same work of the printed edition. So
I really like the things you're suggesting about ways of interacting with the public. I don't know about Canada. In Britain, what's now actually called heritage is really big. So there are many TV programs, for instance, and they're very popular TV programs, in which you have a guide to the landscape. So there's a very popular TV program in Britain called Coast that broadcasts on Sunday, where somebody walks a different section of the British coast each week and describes the landscape and its historical associations, interviews local experts. Of course, they have lots of beautiful shots. And this is done for all sorts of parts of the country. So it's both landscape appreciation and appreciation of the history of the landscape. And this is something that the website could be converted towards doing. The problem about public access to websites seems to me not that if it's scholarly, it will put them off. This is actually quite easy to navigate. It's how do the public find it amongst all the other tens of thousands of things that they might find. So mass media is fine, but when it's just a plethora of possible things, how are you going to know to get there? There has to be something that centralizes attention. The TV is still a very good medium for that. What we have done with this, we haven't got it onto TV yet, but what we have done with it is we've had some partnership with local museums, because it's still a very popular tourist location. And the local museums have links to the website. They have their little brochures that do allow you to walk along the old picturesque route and tell you where to stop. So we're factored into that, and with an exhibition at the local museum as well. So that actually brings you thousands and tens of thousands of the public. And indeed, my colleague for his website, not Bloomfield, has done precisely what you suggested there, created an app you download to your phone and allows you to walk around various bits of South London, looking at the sites where theatres used to be in the Shakespearean time. And each time you stop, you can then listen to a little podcast about what it is that used to happen there. We could do that, and it would actually work better, because in South London, there may have been a Shakespearean theatre there, but you're actually standing looking at an office block. It's not that interesting. So there are possible further stages with this that you could do, because they all take money, time, and investment to make that happen. Yeah.
Could you say something on the survival of the manuscript, how it got to the British Library, and also perhaps a little more cover, really, the question. Also, was it the only manuscript of a talk created by Bloomfield, or perhaps a friend or partner to distribute to other people. And finally, something on the manuscript of a poem, which you referred to, did it come down together with a, or was it separate?
Hang on. Let's get to the right place. Where are we? Manuscripts of the Banks of Wye. I won't give you a long answer, but
Okay,
all right. They're all in the British Library.
So there are multiple copies.
Yeah, there are multiple drafts.
I'm just guessing about that. But
yeah, but that's the poem manuscript.
okay.
There's only one sketchbook tour journal manuscript, and that's because it was created in a blank book. So it was bound from the start, although it has some pages tipped into it, and the book was sent around amongst the party who had been on the Wye over the subsequent years, and they added bits. So it's very much a co-creation, in fact. That was the sole manuscript for that. And all Bloomfield's manuscripts, poetry manuscripts, and his tour manuscript, and most of his letters were left to the British Museum by one of his descendants, subsequently the British Library. So that's how they've come down. I did an edition of his letters too, and about 3/4 of them were in the British Library, and then the rest were just scattered everywhere.
Does that mean that the letters that he sent around that he sent were returned to his descendants after his death?
Yes, quite a lot of them, and then there are quite a lot in. Excuse me. It's hard to talk and click at the same time. There are quite a lot that were collected just because he was well known. So
Yes.
ended up with autograph collectors or being bought by. There we are. My edition of his letters. So there are about 500 letters in there. So they've ended up in libraries, a lot in America actually, because he was well known. So people in the 19th century bought them at auction, and lots of university libraries ended up getting them donated. So there's a couple in McGill. Although after the retirement of the rare books librarian about 5 years ago, one of them got lost. I saw him put it into his desk when I was in the rare books room, and I thought, that doesn't look like it's been catalogued. I'm sure he knows what he's doing, this chap. And then subsequently they couldn't find it after this chap retired. So I don't know quite where that went. So yes, the letters got circulated around as well. And so I did that, the list of letters. So that's actually the Banks of Wye edition we've just been looking at has lots of hyperlinks to particular letters in this edition, which relates to the Banks of Wye tour. To answer your question, your general question about the, as it were, the scholarly prestige of doing this kind of thing, when I started doing these two things, I didn't really care about that because I had already published, a lot of things with Oxford and Cambridge in traditional book form, and so I didn't have any more prestige that I needed to do. But if I needed to get, if I was a young scholar, I think I would be trying to do both. I don't think I've been wanting to pin my career advancement on solely doing things on the web, precisely because there isn't a sort of, as far as university committees go, tenure committees and whatnot, there's no general imprimatur. There's no equivalent on the web to the words Oxford University Press committees who are too lazy to actually do the hard work of reading it all and then making a judgment. So the other thing that haunts me about web editions, which isn't a problem with Oxford University Press, is stability. Oxford, I'm doing an edition of Humphrey Davy's letters, the scientist letters. for Oxford University Press. And that'll be there, you know, forever. It'll be in libraries in 400 years' time, I expect, somewhere. But they're only going to print 400 copies, you know, and it's going to cost £400. So posterity might be able to access it in 400 years' time, but not many scholars will actually be able to afford to access it now. Whereas it works the other way around with the web. Anyone can access it now if you can get them to see where it is. But will it still be there in 100 years' time? That's what worries me. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk and the work that you've done on the online material looks fabulous. I'm not sure if I'm not a 19th centuryist. I study post-colonial literature and but I've written about it. I'm interested in how the picturesque continues to reverberate in the post-colonial context and in particular in India. And so when I was listening to what you were saying about Bloomfield's poem, so the poem was published with that that image of the archway,
right?
And I wondered, and it seems like as you demonstrated in the reading of the poem and your discussion, that there's a kind of there's definitely an unsettling of the picturesque experience that is associated with tourism at the time through the poem,
right?
But perhaps that you get a much deeper sense of that by looking at published work alongside the written manuscript, the sketches, and the letters that would not have been published and circulated in
right.
the same way. And Bloomfield's poem circulated quite widely, as I understand it. It did circulate quite widely.
Yeah, that's right. All of that. Yeah.
Okay, so then it's. I find it that I in many ways it kind of resonates for me with sort of again my post-colonial kind of uptake of the picturesque and sort of like pushing back against it and I mean for example like the laborers in the field, Jamaica Kincaid's account of Lucy traveling in the train to the country place with Mariah, and she Mariah wants to show her the beautiful field and she pulls up the blind and Lucy says, well, all I can imagine is my relatives working in the Caribbean. So I find I'm wondering. I think the idea of the map is a great one as a kind of an additional. But I'm kind of thinking about how I'm wondering how those early picturesque images and the texts that accompany them. Finds its way to places like India and through, I guess it's like Daniel's, is it the father and the son, or it's like, there's two of them. And think about how, like that picturesque is kind of stretched and punctured, as it moves out from, because it seems like you're talking about like this is kind of ground zero of the picturesque, and then let's think about how it moves outward from there and gets
I think
refined.
Yes, you're creating an analogy, and I think it's a good one.
Yeah.
Between it's not quite ground zero for the picturesque. We're
No.
about 30 years in when Bloomfield takes his tour. It's an organised tour that's well established, and those pictures that I showed at the start, before you came in, yes,
I'm sorry.
the Turners and the Gertins are already circulating. So he's able to have a subsequent take on it. But I think there is an analogy to be made between the difference in class perspective that's created by class difference and class exploitation and Bloomfield's awareness of that, and therefore his marginal and uncomfortable position on this tour amongst gentlefolk as the sort of paid for poet who is and isn't of the labouring class. That position, there is an analogy to be made there between class difference within Britain and then racial difference, which is also, of course, a difference in the colonies of who labours and who doesn't labour,
Mhm.
who has power and wealth, and who doesn't, and labours for other people's power. The picturesque, there's an analogy between the two things, yes, that's there in people like Kincaid.
Mhm.
Is it there in the pictures of Hodges and Westall and Daniels when they went to India and so on, and applied a picturesque that they had learned back in Britain as young illustrators to these foreign landscapes? I'm not sure that it is there in their pictures really, unless you then start imaginatively asking, well, what does it mean that the person decoratively figured at the front of that picturesque Tahitian landscape is actually not a white person, but a Tahitian? You can ask that, but I'm not sure the picture itself asks it. The sketches, Bloomfield's sketches, and the sketchbook aren't particularly disturbing of picturesque viewpoint. It's the prose that is, actually. And the only other thing to say about that is that he wanted to publish the prose and far more of the sketches. And that was going to happen. That was his idea. He was going to publish the whole triple thing: sketches, prose journal, and poetry as a sort of multimedia book. That was his ambition. And as was sort of happening with Turner and Rogers in their poem sketchbook Italy, but it didn't come to pass. His publisher, it's just particular circumstances, did some bad speculations and bankrupted the company. And in the bankruptcy, it became unclear who actually owned Bloomfield's copyrights. They kind of got sold on in the bankruptcy business, and it all got held up in court. And Bloomfield subsequently, at the same time, was going out of fashion. And by the time that was resolved, there was a massive crash in 1816 after the Napoleonic War, and the publishing industry went into big recession. So it never happened. Otherwise, you would have got that interesting interrelation of poetic and prose perspectives on labour and landscape being published. Yeah.
I was thinking about Sandeep Banerjee at McGill. He's got a project that is looking at the picturesque in Himalayan context. And, I used one of this essay that I published a couple of years ago on where he's looking at the photography of Samuel Bourne, where he labors to create the kinds of picturesque scenes that you're describing on the Wye in the Himalayan context. But then he doesn't develop the argument a lot in that particular essay, but he does then talk about how the journals that Bourne wrote while he was, with his laborers carrying the cameras around and trying to get these particular shots that resonated with picturesque aesthetic, despite himself, revealed this kind of struggle to attain that soft focus in a sense, and also to kind of keep the local community anonymous in the context of the shots, and then reinforce the kind of control of the image. So it seems like there's the where Bowring seems to be kind of embracing the complexities of the situation in the colonial context, but you have to sort of struggle much more to kind of read the image against the grain. So I find the Bowring thing quite interesting. Great.
I have a question about the Iambic Tetrameter and the passage we were looking at. No man could sit unmoved. And then he repeats the word unmoved a few lines later. And it seems to me that the tetrameter is a quite rapid meter.
Yes.
So we're sort of moving through the landscape as we're coursing through this tetrameter line. And I'm wondering about the pun on unmoved. People are sitting unmoved as they're reading this poem, but vicariously or virtually moving through the landscape with him. So what about the history of that meter vis-a-vis the tour poem? And also just to pick up on your question about the how disruptive is this? I like what you told us about looking through the cracks in the floorboard to see the people eating. So that's something that would appear in the journal, but that's sealed up. We don't get that intimate view of the people eating in the poem.
Right.
So it seems that the prose gives us access to something that the maybe more 18th century verse form, the polite form, sort of restricts.
Yes, to answer the last bit first, Julia, the critics, and you can see that in a couple of the reviews that I've posted up there on the, criticised him anyway for being too colloquial, too slangy, too informal in the verse, in the diction, and in one or two of the perceptions and things that it said. Not proper. The kind of critique that Wordsworth got, Bloomfield gets as well. They perceive it, some of the critics, as being a little bit jokey, a little bit slangy. So we may, looking back on it, on that verse, think that it isn't that intimate, or that it does conform to politeness. But actually, at the time, critics are saying, no, this isn't properly polite, actually. So it doesn't go into the detail of, I look through because it doesn't, in the manner of much 18th century poetry, it genericizes the I, so it doesn't give personal details very much. But yes, there are glimpses in the verse of engagement with labourers. Not that particular one of eavesdropping on the maids chatting at breakfast, but there are others where he notices. So that's that. The other aspect of your question, the history of the metre, yes, he adopts it deliberately from Samuel Butler's 17th century mock epic peregrination poem Hudibras, which takes the form of a mock knightly quest. This was kind of Don Quixote kind of poem. So the Iambic Tetrameter is associated in its history with movement, the quest, but a comic quest, a quest that doesn't quite turn into heroic couplets, but the couplets are always a little bit shorter. So that's the history of the form, and with that form, with that history from Butler, Butler also has, because it's a mock epic and deliberately comic, and pathetic is the mode of the comedy, Butler uses slangy diction. So there's a deliberate choice Bloomfield's made there, which is interesting. He doesn't go for the standard pentameter couplets, which would have been more august and more sober. He goes for the more slangy and more comic. And that's to do with undercutting pretensions and not seeming to be a pompous, disembodied narrator. And that's his way, I think, Bloomfield's way of coping with the fact that I'm just a labourer poet in this odd position of being amongst the gentlemen, and I'm just writing about my holidays. I can't quite presume to be writing heroic couplets here. So I'll use a more jokey form.
And yet the last stand of the royalist forces is not politicized. That's sort of swept under the common human trials and tribulations of time and existence, right? There's nothing political, no political statement he makes of the Civil War.
Not about that particular thing, yeah.
Comment?
Well, let me just, to finish, return to, I just want to show you this at the end. This. The last page of his manuscript journal. My cat, in his usual attitude while warming himself at the fire.
So that memes on Facebook started with Bloomfield. Is
So
the
that's-
first cat? I mean, you know, like more serious, would that be like the first cat to be part of an illustrated, you know, kind of
I think
moment?
so. So That's when he got back home again, back to London.
Well, you know, thanks for your talk, Liam.